Media plays a prominent role in our everyday lives. Whether we get our news from TV, the radio, newspapers, or the internet, media is everywhere. I sit down with experts and one of the Twin Cities' most reputable journalists as we cover the evolution of media and media sensationalism in some of today's most important topics. I'm Brenda Kamal. Our Issues Twin Cities starts now. Newspapers were first introduced in the 18th century. Color TV was invented in the 1960s. Decades later, and well, media has come a long way. One man witnessed a great deal of the quick evolution of media throughout the decades. To many, Don Shelby is known as the Twin Cities' legendary newsman.
Wrecks and fires were the predominant thing that you covered. City council meetings, you covered a lot of school board meetings, things that the community was focused on, education, civil rights, always got the coverage. But even back then, you hate to say that there was a time or is a time when the motto, if it bleeds, it leads, was important. It was important because in the smaller markets where I was working at the time, those are very easy stories to cover. Shootings and bank robberies and fires, those are very easy stories to cover. You don't have to go very deep on those. And so young people just learning their way into the business, populating those small markets, that's the kind of things they will cover. And if they're any good, then they will keep expanding their interest and change the editorial content of a newscast.
How has the media evolved throughout the years?
Certainly technology has evolved the media faster than any thinking has done. I remember being in the newsroom and we were shooting black and white film at the time. And we had our own processor that would handle that, and we were on black and white television, before color television. And then color came in, which opened up a brand new thing, and then color film happened. That changed the nature of what television news looked like. It looked more real. Then in about 1973, the Ikegami company came to me and said, and I was news director at the time, said, there's going to be a change between film and we think videotape is the future. And we will give you 3 cameras. These are $50,000 cameras. We'll give you 3 cameras and 2 editing suites and all the tape that you can use for 2 years if you'll be a test station for us. And in my wisdom, I said, you got it crazy, because news is film. It's not videotape. And that's one of the 47 stupidest things that I've ever done in my life. And so they went to another station next to us, and it wasn't until 3 years later that we could afford to actually buy the technology. But that happened. Then microwave transmission, the ability to do live shots away from the studio without running 10 miles of cable, that was an incredible change in how we covered news.
And then came the internet in the 80s. Cell phones started to take notice in the 90s. The marriage of the two birthed social media.
Basically, anybody with a pencil or anybody with a computer can be someone who provides solid information. You hope it's solid. Though most of those people who are blogging and most of those people who are sending in their handycam videos or cell phone videos, they're not trained as journalists, so they don't know what balance is, and they don't know what truth really is, and they don't know how to represent accurately quotes. It's basically covering something and giving their opinion. That wasn't a danger when people went, that's just their opinion. But now it seems seamless that it joins with actual news, and they see it on the internet and they go, that's believable. Which is the biggest mistake anybody can ever make, to look at anything that is not a traditional journalism news site and read a blog or read something that has a political bent and say, well, that must be the truth.
How do we discern what is real news from what is being made up?
Ground yourself in those people who have dedicated themselves as professionals to a creed of public information. And so the trusted sites, the New York Times and the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times and Louisville Courier-Journal, wherever you want to look, you want to read those sites, and including the network television sites, because they're putting their reputations saying you have to trust us. And if we're wrong, we're in trouble, because journalists only have one true job. If you get it wrong, you're fired. And that's not something that is a pressure against somebody who's just working out of their bedroom, typing out on a computer. They're not going to fire themselves if they get it wrong. And most of the time won't even admit they're wrong.
What is real journalism to you?
Real journalism is giving people information that they absolutely need to know in order to conduct, in a constitutionally formed democracy or republic, where they are in charge of making decisions and voting in people who will carry out policy to guide the ship of state. You need to give them that information, because in the First Amendment of the Constitution, it said that you can, without fear of punishment, report against the government. You can take a position, an adversary position, against the government if the facts support that. Not just because you have a political opinion. If you discover facts that says the government is doing wrong, you have an absolutely free hand in reporting that, and you cannot be restrained and you cannot be punished. So the press is fundamental to constitutional government, to the freedom and liberty of Americans to freely decide what's right and what's wrong. Journalists need to keep that in mind, that they are backed up by the framers of the Constitution. And I have literally done that when I walked into a situation where I was frightened because the person was extremely powerful and smarter than I was. I had to look over my shoulder. It was an exercise that I would do, and look over my shoulder, and I would see Madison and Jefferson and Washington standing behind me and saying, "Go, kid, ask the tough question. Hold them accountable." But I couldn't do that, some hick kid. I could not do that myself. I had to know these guys had my back, and they wanted me to do that, that it was important that I ask the tough questions and hold people accountable.
Coming up on Our Issues Twin Cities, media coverage on healthcare issues. One of the most covered topics in media is health. Media plays an enormously influential role on the public's response to health issues. Which health topics get the most coverage?
I think infectious diseases get a lot of coverage, but I think that's because they are oftentimes perceived as scary and kind of unknown, and so people tend to have a real interest in those areas. But new research, things that are just coming out, they also get a lot of attention.
In 2014, 11 cases of Ebola, an infectious disease out of West Africa, were reported in the United States. 2 lives were taken. The coverage of Ebola was staggering, creating a wave of alarm. Every news channel was reporting on this deadly disease making its way into America.
Many criticized the wall-to-wall coverage of Ebola being disproportionate to the people that were affected in the U.S. When the media was covering Ebola here in the United States, do you think that they were helpful or created fear among the nation for ratings?
Some of the images, helped contribute. So the fact that, people were, wearing the full personal protective equipment, caused concern. And the fact that it was in the news, because it did contribute to the concern, because it was constantly on people's minds.
Ebola blew up in the public consciousness when the American workers came down with Ebola and were being treated in Dallas and in New York. That's when the story got big, but we still didn't go in depth about what's happening in the Ebola crisis. Some stations, big stations, ended up going to Nigeria and Sierra Leone and going to other places and saying, this is a problem. Really? Ebola's been a problem for a long time.
What's been happening with Ebola is globally unprecedented. First, it moved from where it normally was in Central Africa. Now we were seeing cases in West Africa. That was unprecedented. Then we had spread outside of Africa for the first time ever. So all those things were unprecedented, and so definitely worthy of news coverage. But I think the fact that it was just so continuous kept it in the public's eye. And one of the things that concerns me about that is when the public is concerned and upset, then there's this we need to respond, and government feels that we have to do something to calm the public. And I think sometimes there were some decisions that were made that were more to assuage the public's fear than were really going to be practically useful.
Do you think it diverted people of knowing what really was the issue at large? Because a lot of people didn't really even know what Ebola was. They just heard the word and they were just scared.
I think that's a factor because we were having a very hard time getting some of the key messages about Ebola. And one thing that came up, and there were some scientists who kind of were speculative in some of the comments they made. Well, maybe Ebola could become airborne. Well, the media picked up on that, and right away, Ebola airborne. So you've got, the public is worried that they're going to walk outside and be exposed. So there wasn't a good understanding that in order to acquire Ebola, you have to have some serious, contact with people. And in fact, the people that developed Ebola in the United States, the nurses, which was very unfortunate, but they had prolonged contact with the case, with his blood, his body fluids. It wasn't casual. And yet we had people, I don't dare leave my house. If I go to the supermarket, am I going to come down with Ebola? No understanding of the transmission. So yes, you're right. The challenge was that there was a lot of attention, but not enough information.
147 people were sickened by the measles outbreak in California's Disneyland in December of 2014. The outbreak received a vast amount of media attention, sparking fear and a vaccination debate.
The fact that the exposures occurred at Disneyland, Disneyland is sort of the archetypical perfect place, the happiest place on earth. You shouldn't be coming down with measles there. And so I think that caught the public's imagination. And what I saw for the first time in a decade was that all of a sudden, kind of the average parent, 90% of which are vaccinating their kids, started speaking out and saying, you know what, enough of this. We want attention to us. We vaccinate our kids. We're concerned about folks that don't and what impact that has on the community. And that was really the first time in over a decade that we saw that. So we found in public health, we were very grateful, and we felt like the coverage of that outbreak had a significant effect and was a significant turning point in how people viewed vaccination.
It also created a debate among the U.S. and whether to vaccinate or not vaccinate.
What it really highlighted was the importance and the importance of vaccination and the implications of not vaccinating. That not vaccinating is not a private decision. It's a decision that has consequences for the community at large. And this outbreak was a perfect example. You chose not to vaccinate, you brought measles to this special place. Now we're seeing outbreaks across the country.
Do you think that the media creates a fear of their coverage of health issues, such as Ebola, maybe even measles, instead of improving the understanding?
Media now is 24/7 and so continuous. It's very interesting to see the evolution of some of these situations. So even with measles, which as I said was really positive, and I felt like we were good partners with the media in getting messages out. What was interesting is as it went along, then parents were speaking out, this is important, your decisions affect my child, that kind of thing. And the next thing it almost got to the point where it went too far. So, the coverage can just go on too long.
Right, and the media will keep going to drive up the ratings just because people are continuously watching.
Right, if they're interested in it, we'll keep coming up with the stories.
Now the reporters are covering stories that they have to do 4 versions of that story. And if you watch CNN or you watch MSNBC or Fox or whatever. It's just the repetition of the same material.
Up next on Our Issues Twin Cities, media representation on racial issues. Over the last few years, coverage on racial issues have resurfaced and have once more been tested.
It began in February 2012 when 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot by a neighborhood watch volunteer in Florida. In August 2014, 18-year-old Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. From then, similar cases of Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and recently Walter Lamar Scott swept the nation. Media outlets certainly didn't shy away from these stories, but some have questioned the authenticity of how media covers racial issues.
The two construction workers, white, who witnessed Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, Missouri, and testified, who told the news media that his hands were up in the air and he was surrendering when the officer, Darren Wilson, fired on him, were completely missing from the media or from the grand jury investigation into the death of Michael Brown. And that's a travesty because there were facts available that weren't reported.
This problem existed 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And so what we do is we take a local issue now that has great sensational value and make it a national news story. These cases were happening for years, but we didn't focus our attention on those important things. Because without a pivotal event, you don't have an entry point as a journalist.
A similar incident took place in our community last January. 24-year-old Marcus Ryan Golden was shot and killed by police in St. Paul after allegedly driving his vehicle towards officers.
What's the difference between what happened here locally and stories like Brown's and Martin's that received an enormous amount of national media attention?
We've had fewer instances of officer-involved killings, although there have been more in St. Paul over the last few years than in any other city in the state of Minnesota. Yet St. Paul suffers nonetheless from the collective national incidents of the death of young black males who are unarmed at the hands of police or law enforcement officers. Marcus Golden was demonized. Media reports continue to say that he had a firearm in the vehicle, that he had a troubled background, but they failed to point out that he had a concealed carry license or permit, which was issued by the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department and approved by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So to simply say that there was a gun in his car or within reach without mentioning that he had a permit to carry a concealed weapon that was legally issued tends to demonize or make him look like he had his death coming at the hands of police officers.
How do you think the media portrayal of black men has changed in the U.S. over the past decades?
There's still a great dearth, vast distortions, and a lack of balance in terms of the coverage of poor people and people of color in general, seniors, it goes across the board. And again, this imposes negative, destructive superiority images on white people and negative, destructive inferiority images on people of color and low-income people in this country. It's become more subtle, more sophisticated, more complex, with a few notable exceptions, but still a long way from being equitable or fair and balanced.
Do you think that the media sometimes blurs the lines between factual news reporting and opinions?
I don't know so much that they blur the lines as that they do not have a good grasp on the total situation. They don't have relations in those communities. They don't have resources. They don't have people who can fact check or provide them with background. They don't have any experience, and the only thing that most white people learn about communities of color is how to stay out of them. So they come in as outsiders, they capture the information, and unfortunately, much of what passes for news today either comes through public relations vehicles or are events staged for the news media. They don't involve a lot of independent investigation, analysis, or fact-checking. You know, here's what happened. We turned on the cameras, we turned on the microphones. Now you see it, now you don't. And it may be accurate, it may be blurred, it may be distorted, it may be one-sided. It is not necessarily fair and balanced.
And whether media may not always be fair and balanced, the main focus is primarily ratings.
I've always hated ratings. I never looked at a ratings book because that wasn't what was important as a journalist. What was important as a journalist, whether you were telling important stories that were helping people understand their world. That was what was important. And that ought to be what is important to a journalist. No journalist should ever look at a ratings book. Let the general manager and the news director look at the ratings book, but the reporters should never look at the ratings book.
What do you fear most about the future of journalism?
That it continues to try to please the public. My concern for journalism that it's a popularity contest. Journalists have got to stop being popular. They have to be fearless and say, listen, if the cost of me telling you the truth is that I lose my job, I'm ready.
Thank you for joining me this week on Our Issues Twin Cities. I'm Brenda Kamal. See you next time.